talk today is when God falls silent. Gracia.
Good morning. I'd like to tell you a little story from the days when my 8-member family used to sing 4-part harmony in churches all over the place. We sang old Christian hymns, beautiful harmonies, and whenever we sang, the audience would just get so quiet and many people in tears, and the spirit, which I used to think was the presence of God, whatever it is that music brings to us, would come down over that congregation. Well, we were singing a song called Take My Life, and it's a song about consecrating your hands and your feet and your heart and your voice to God's service. And it's a really difficult song to sing because there's so many body parts and you have to remember all this stuff that's going on. Well, my mother had this beautiful, clear voice, very loud. She and I sang alto together, and she got one of the verses messed up. I was only about 14 or so. And you know how nothing is as funny as when you're not supposed to be laughing? So she sings in this beautifully clear voice, "Take my heart." And I just lost it. I mean, it was so loud. Well, we're standing up in front of the church, and all I could do was, I just turned totally around like this, and my shoulders were shaking. I could not stop, Thankfully, it was towards the end, and when we got done, I hightailed it out the church and around the side of the building and just died laughing. It was horrible. It was just, what do you do? There's nowhere to go. But those are, some of the good memories of what I went through. And today, I'm going to be sharing with you the pivotal moment in my life when faith ended, when for me God fell silent. But that was truly the light at the end of the tunnel for me. It was when, in a way, my life began again. And I'm sure that many of you will understand that as I speak. I'm going to read to you from Leviticus 13:45 and 46. Don't do this often. The leprous person who has the disease shall wear torn clothes and let the hair of his head hang loose. He shall cover his upper lip and cry, "Unclean, unclean." He shall remain unclean as long as he has the disease. He is unclean, he shall live alone. His dwelling shall be outside the camp. Now, if you're a visitor, don't run out the door. If you've been told this is a liberal church, it is, I promise you. And I won't be speaking today on the literal interpretation of this verse that I suffered through for 30-some years. But instead, I'd like to tell you today how I associate with this verse as a woman who suffered from clinical depression while I was a conservative Christian. Many pastors will tell you that you vanquish depression if you repent and seek forgiveness. Christians use scriptures like 1 Corinthians 10:13 that says God will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you can bear. And so, if you can't bear something, then it's your fault. A lot of preachers tell you that mental illness is the result of demon possession. Now imagine how that feels. The pressure upon a Christian by their fellow members who are constantly quoting happy scriptures. Rejoice in the Lord, be glad always. And you're sitting there with a weight of sadness so heavy that you don't even know if you can get through the next day. You wake up in the morning and you think, how am I going to face this? And yet you're supposed to be happy, or it's your fault. And this is what they do to you. I remember clearly the day that I noticed something was wrong with me. I'd been in the hospital for 5 months at the bedside of my nephew who was severely brain damaged after the car accident that took my oldest sister and her husband and my niece. I'd just been diagnosed with Graves' disease, which was an overactive thyroid condition, just before the accident. And going through the 3 funerals that we went through and being at the bedside of my nephew, I didn't even think about Graves' disease or get treatment for it. I was too busy. And looking back, I realized I didn't take care of myself first, as you have to before you help others. I just pushed myself beyond what I could endure. And one morning I was eating breakfast, and I clearly remember looking across at the table at my husband, and I thought to myself, he's poisoning my food. And it was, in a way, the excuse of why I was starting to feel so horrendously bad. And I thought, well, if he's poisoning my food, I can't ask him why. I can't tell him that I know. I can't tell him that I found out. And that was the point that I realized my thinking was starting to become confused, because my gentle husband never would have done anything remotely like that. And so I just completely stopped eating. And it took him 4 days to notice. And he said, Gracia, did you eat anything today? Did you eat anything yesterday? And I said no, and by that time I'd forgotten why I'd stopped eating. So there I was, back in my youth, so skinny that my ribs were showing, my heart pumping almost twice the rate that it should have been, probably dehydrated. I was only sleeping a few hours a night. And you would think at this point that the first thing we should have done was to rush to the hospital, to a doctor, to someone with an education, perhaps. But instead, as church tradition demanded, my husband called the pastor. The pastor came to my house with his wife to cancel me. Now, well, here was the cancel. My pastor told me that I had not trusted God enough, that I was mad at God for the accident, which was true. He said that my pathway to God had been blocked by doubt and rebellion, that I had not prayed enough. And he told me that demons were attacking me. He counseled against going to a counselor. He said therapists would turn me from God. He said depression medication would ruin me. And he said, pray, pray, pray. Now, normally, although I was quiet about it in order to survive in that church, I hardly ever listened to the man. But in this weakened state, in a state of confusion of the beginnings of massive, severe depression, he actually got through to me. And unfortunately, in my mind, what I came away with from what he said was, number one, it was all my fault. Number two, I could only fix it by prayer. And number three, that I was evil. Never at any other point would I have listened to him. I spent that entire night in prayer, hoping that it would help. But the next morning I was so much worse that thankfully my husband took me straight to the doctor, where I was checked into a care facility, and they began finally to treat the Graves' disease, to give me medications that would help me sleep, to give me a medication that would help make me hungry enough to eat. And it probably saved my life, literally, and in every other way. And in this care facility, I had access, for the first time in my life, to a group of therapists and counselors who gave me the first rational, reasonable advice I'd ever gotten in my life. They weren't pushy. They didn't try to convince me against Christianity or anything that I believed. But it was practical, reasonable, supportive advice that I was a good person, that it wasn't my fault, that being hurt and devastated at the loss of my family was not something I had to be ashamed of, that it was human, it was natural. Now, the first day, all I remember being in that care facility was that I kept trying to pray, and I was so confused that I just wasn't myself. And the nurses were so patient and so kind to me. And finally, they did one of the best things they could have done. They put me that evening very loosely, put my arms in the sleeves of a straitjacket, and they didn't tie it up. But she took one of the long strings and she tied it to my bedpost, and she covered me up with a blanket, and she just said to me, you're going to lay here and go to sleep. And she said, you can't pray anymore because I've tied you up. Now at the time, oh my goodness, it felt like a cocoon of safety. I felt safe. I felt supported. And I felt so calm. And I was laying there flat on my back, staring up at the ceiling. And a moment of clarity came to me. And I realized that God wasn't there for me. That the God I had been raised with was totally absent. There was nothing. And I thought, if he's not here, it can't possibly be true. And that weight of all those years of trying to please a God that I'd been told about, it just lifted off of me. And I felt like I put down 15,000 pounds off my shoulders. And that was the beautiful tunnel of light that I began to see. I didn't have to attain to all this. I didn't have to please a God that I never could please. And so there I was, in a mental institution, halfway in a straitjacket, and I'm at the best point in my life. Now, I don't advocate anything. I'm not a professional. All I can tell you is what depression felt like to me and what I learned from it. A few days later, I began to think more clearly and to be able to speak more clearly. And on the fourth day, my husband brought my 3 little girls to see me, and it was an hour of complete happiness. And my youngest daughter, when it was time to go, she just wrapped her arms and legs around me and wouldn't let go. And her father had to pry her out of my arms. And I sat by the door for hours afterwards, refusing to leave the door. And I couldn't understand at that time why I couldn't be with my children. But I began to get so much better. I went home after 10 days, exhausted, my overactive thyroid not yet controlled. And I went through 3 months of depression so deep that I sometimes wondered if I could make it through the day, but it was always my 3 daughters that I knew needed me, that helped me through that. They were the only ones that I felt safe around. They were the only ones who loved me as I was. They loved me unconditionally. They didn't put rules and restrictions on me. It was no wonder that I felt safe with them. And during this time, I lost most of my friends. No one except my husband knew how to speak to me or even tried. My family didn't know what to do with me. Most people sent me cards and letters quoting scriptures on telling me to cheer up or to have faith in God, or the scriptures that would tell me that I had demons. It was like having a contagious disease. I might as well have had leprosy. People would walk in a wide circle around me at church so they wouldn't get too close. They wouldn't sit beside of me on the pew. I felt invisible and forgotten. And losing your social circle is one of the most horrible things you can do to a depressed person. And I felt like I became an outcast. Everything I experienced is typical still today in many conservative churches. Stories like mine are very common. Until I suffered from depression, I didn't even know what it was. I didn't know that exercise, healthy eating are so important, that stress reduction and wise choices in the problems of your life are what help prevent further episodes. Everyone around me used such shallow judgments about people with depression or any kind of mental illness. So looking back, I felt like my church and its restrictions helped to cause the depression, condemned me for having it, and then tried to prevent its treatment, thus digging a pit, throwing me into it, and cutting the rope that would have helped me climb out. And even though this was traumatic, this was the time when I began to be set free. My doubts about religion, about the nature of God, about the truths my church claimed, all were collapsing. And this was exactly what I needed. The most painful period of my life showed me the light at the end of the tunnel, the pathway to freedom, the loosening of the chains. I'm sure many of you have gone through similar doubts about established religion. You know exactly what I'm talking about. But those doubts were what led you all here today. Doubts in established authority and in the established ways of thinking can lead us to freedom. I do believe that depression and its aftermath delayed my exit from the church, but it taught me how much strength I had. It taught me that I could stand alone if I had to. It also taught me that my friendships were not healthy for me. Now you may ask, why do women endure such patriarchal churches? Why do they contribute to them? Why do women help keep other women in bondage under this male leadership? Why do people contribute to systems that go against their own good? And how can family members stand by when people are being emotionally abused? And this is just my personal opinion, born of my experience. But women can find safety in those realms only if they follow the rules and obtain approval by actively pressuring other women, by tattling, shaming, holding women below them in rank in harsh judgment. thus allowing that spotlight of oppression and hatred to focus on someone else rather than themselves. I often saw women stand by in silence or in complete approval as another woman was degraded, judged without mercy, limited in horrendous ways by the male leadership. It was the only way of achieving safety. I truly believe that without those women in support, there isn't any church like that that could continue, and yet they still do. It's one of the harder to understand paradoxes. I do know that people who are trapped in limited need a different standard of judgment because we can't understand. They behave differently. Patriarchy puts women into binders. That just slipped out. Women are bound by tradition and ignorance and superstition. And I can recognize that patriarchal language from 10 miles away, as I'm sure you can. It makes such a difference what church you attend. It makes such a difference when there's freedom of thought, when there are freedom of differing opinions, when you can choose a different path tomorrow and no one will question you or limit you or bind you. I'm so grateful for a church like this, where education is celebrated and members of this church spend their lives helping people in distress. This is a beautiful poem by Patricia Lynn Riley. Imagine a woman who believes it is right and good that she is a woman who honors her experience and tells her stories, who refuses to carry the sin of others within her body and life. Imagine a woman who believes she is good, a woman who trusts and respects herself, a woman who listens to her needs and desires and meets them with tenderness and grace. Imagine a woman who has acknowledged the past's influences on the present, a woman who has walked through her past, who is healed into the present. Imagine a woman who authors her own life, a woman who exerts, initiates, and moves on her own behalf, who refuses to surrender except to her truest self and her wisest voice. Imagine a woman who names her own God, a woman who imagines the divine in her image and likeness, who designs her own spirituality and allows it to inform her daily life. Imagine a woman who values the other women in her life, a woman who sits in circles of women, who is reminded of the truth about herself when she forgets. Imagine yourself as this woman. Amen.